Today we are looking at dividing rational expressions. Let's think back to when we learned how to divide fractions. So the first thing we would do when we see our division sign is we would multiply by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal is when we take our second fraction, and the reciprocal is just when we flip it. So instead of 5 being on top, the 5 is on the bottom, and then the 3 switches from the bottom to the top, and then we multiply. So we have 2/3 times 3/5. And if we remember, we simplify first, so our 3's cancel out. Then we multiply straight across. Both of these 3's became a 1, so 2 times 1 is 2, and 1 times 5 is 5. Alright, so when we see two fractions being divided, we multiply by the reciprocal. Alright, so let's do an example. We have 4t plus 8 divided by 3t plus 6 over t minus 3. So since we are dividing, that means we are going to change it to multiplication and change the second fraction to its reciprocal. So we are left with 4t plus 8, because the first one does not change. And then we're going to change to a multiplication symbol. And then we need our reciprocal, which would be t minus 3 over 3t plus 6. And if we look at our first number, 4t plus 8, that is actually over 1. So then we make them both into fractions. The next thing we have to do is simplify, like find our greatest common factor or factor the polynomials. So we can factor this first one up here by pulling a 4 out of both terms. So we have 4 times t plus 2. That's still going to be over 1 times t minus 3 cannot be simplified at all, so we leave it as that. 3t plus 6, we can pull a 3 out of both. So we have 3 and then t plus 2 in the inside. Then we see a t plus 2, which we can cancel those both out. That's all we can simplify, so then we multiply straight across, and we have 4 times t minus 3 over 1, and you do 1 times 3, there we go, and then simplify that, 4t minus 3, and we just have a 3 on the bottom. So there would be your answer. Alright, let's look at another example. Here we have n squared minus 2n minus 24 over n squared plus 6n plus 8 divided by negative n squared plus 8n minus 12 over n squared plus n minus 2. And as soon as we see that division sign, we immediately think multiply by the reciprocal. So our first fraction is going to stay the same, with our n squared minus 2n minus 24 over n squared plus 6n plus 8, and then we multiply times our reciprocal, so our n squared plus n minus 2 goes on the top, all over negative n squared plus 8 n minus 12. Alright, so now that we have switched and changed it to a multiplication problem, we now need to either find the greatest common factor or factor our polynomials. So we're going to start with the top left. We're going to make our little chart over here. So we have n squared minus 2n minus 24. So we're going to have an n and an n, okay? And then we are going to have negative 6 and positive 4, because negative 6 times 4 will give us a negative 24. And then when we subtract the 2, we get our cross multiply, we get our negative 2n in the middle. So that would factor to be n minus 6 and n plus 4 all over. Now let's look at our second one. We'll erase our numbers in here. Alright, so we have n squared plus 6n plus 8. So we're going to have an n going on both sides. And then we have a 4 and a 2, because 4 times 2 is 8. And then when we cross multiply, we will get our 6n in the middle. So we have n plus 4 and n plus 2. Right? There we go. Now we're going to look at our top right with n squared plus n minus 2. And so we're going to put an n in each side. And then to get negative 2, we have to have a 2 and a 1. And since our middle number is positive, we want the bigger number to be positive. So our 1 is going to be negative. So we have n plus 2 times n minus 1. And then if we look at the bottom right, we see that there's a negative sign in front of our n squared. So I'm just going to change that, pull out a negative, so then we have a positive n squared. So this is going to be negative 1 times n squared. Our negative 8n becomes, our positive 8n becomes a negative 8n, and negative 12 becomes a positive 12. Alright, so all we did there was factor out a negative 1, so then we would have a positive n squared. Alright, so now let's factor. We see n squared, so we're going to have an n and an n. And then we have negative 6 and negative 2. So negative 6 times negative 2 is going to be 12. And when we cross multiply, we get our negative 8n. So we're going to have n minus 6 and n minus 2. And remember, we pulled out this negative 1 out front, so we need to have that out there. Right, so now that we are all factored and everything, we can start canceling things out. So if we look at our first fraction here, we see it n plus 4 in both. So let's go ahead and cross those out. And I see nothing in common in between these two, so now let's look diagonally. See an n minus 6 in both of them. And then we have an n plus 2. Alright. So now that first fraction actually is a 1 over 1, or just 1. And now we can cross multiply. So 1 times n minus 1 is just going to be n minus 1. And then 1 times negative 1 times n minus 2 is going to be the negative 1 times n minus 2. And that also equals n minus 1 over, if you wanted to distribute the negative 1, we'd have a negative n plus 2. Right? So there would be your answer. So the only thing that is different from dividing rational expressions and multiplying rational expressions is the fact that when we divide, we just change it to a multiplication problem, and the second fraction becomes its reciprocal. Alright, so let's review. Step 1 would be change to a multiplication problem, and change our second rational expression to its reciprocal. Alright, so that's step number 1. Step number 2 is going to be the same as when we multiplied. So it would be factor or find the greatest common factor. Step 3 would be simplify. And remember, that's going up and down or diagonally. And then step number 4, multiply straight across.